Hello, welcome to the very first session of The Living Room. I'm your host for today, Deborah. Thank you for joining us this Friday afternoon. This is the first time that YWAM SG is going live on Facebook, and we're really excited to have you guys hanging out with us. Some quick administrative matters before we invite our guest on. We would really love to interact with you, and so we invite any questions you have. Just type them in at Slido with the code 62710, and we'll try to answer it. You can also upvote any questions which you think you want to hear the answer to. We'll leave the code in the comment section too. So without further ado, let's invite our guest today on screen, Katy. Hi, Katy.
Hi, Deborah.
Katy is from Iowa in the United States. She did her DTS in Uganda, East Africa in 2015 and has been with YWAM ever since. In 2017, she moved to Singapore and is currently the younger staff on the School of Biblical Studies, or SBS for short. But don't let that fool you. Katy is one of the wisest persons I know. I always enjoy conversations with her, and there's so much to learn from the things she says and how she lives her life. So I'll hand over the time to Katy. Katy, all yours.
Thank you, Deborah. I didn't expect that introduction quite the same, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm an excited guinea pig as we try this out. What I want to start with today, I recently rediscovered a picture that someone drew for me. I'll show you the picture in a second, but I want to share this with you because I love it. So I've been telling anyone who will listen about this story. It's from about 3 years ago when I first came to YWAM Singapore. And it was a season of transition for me, transitioning from Uganda to here, from home to here, adjusting to life in Singapore, new friends, different things happening. And one of my other friends was also going through a similar thing. She was also in missions, readjusting, transitioning. And both of us were asking this question about what is home? What is home to us? Since our home is something so changing, of course. And with that is kind of the question of what does it mean to make God our home then? What does it mean that he's the stable one? He's the one we can find our comfort and stability in. Just this question, what does home mean to us? So I had this little friend at the time. He was 5 years old, very cute, very sweet. We were close, played games in the back of class. We had a lot of fun together. And there was a worship session where we had kind of a carpet in the middle of the room, all of these markers and papers you can just go color on. Simple, fun thing during worship time. So I was there with the kids. And Jehu, my friend, he drew a picture for me. And this is what he drew without knowing any of my situation. He drew this, and what he said was, you and Jesus are living in this house together. And that was such a precious thing for me because, like I said, I was struggling with this question of what is home? And so for this 5-year-old to just speak this out and say, you have this home with Jesus, it was something that gave me a lot of hope, a lot of encouragement in a time that was quite lonely, actually. So just this thing about having this home with God was a very precious message to both me and my friend. And that's where I'm going with this today. When Paul also talked a little bit about having this heavenly home, in a sense. So this is something that the Apostle Paul talked about in the book of 2 Corinthians. So I'll have us read this. And it's really about, there's something bigger than what's happening here. There's something bigger than our situation. There is this eternal home. So I'll be reading from 2 Corinthians, starting in chapter 4, verse 15 through 5:10. It's a bit of a chunk, so I will read it, and then we'll kind of dissect what that might mean for us. Right, so this is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting at verse 16 on to 5:10. If you have your Bible, you can follow along with me. Verse 16, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, We have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. All right, so like I said, this is a bit of a chunk, so we'll kind of take it apart, what it's actually meaning. Paul is talking a lot about outer self wasting away, this earthly home being destroyed, all of this stuff. What is he meaning? Within the context of 2 Corinthians, we know that Paul had been facing some opposition. Likely in the city of Corinth, there was opposition undermining his ministry, but we know that Paul also endured a lot of persecution. So if you look at chapter 11, we won't go there now, but I'll tell you about it. Paul gives a list of a lot of the things that he had been suffering. And we know that this is actually before his Roman imprisonment. So this list grew later on in his life. But it's this huge long list about 5 times I had the 40 lashes less one, 3 times beaten with rods, once he was stoned, 3 times shipwrecked, danger from everything. So Paul went through a lot of physical pain for the sake of the gospel. And so this is some of the context that he's speaking into as he talks about suffering and affliction. We know he really had a right to be talking about these things because he endured so much. And specifically in the immediate context, Paul has spent chapter 3 talking about the glory of God. All of chapter 3 is talking about the glorious new covenant, which is Jesus paying for our sins and giving us life, and how that's such a glorious and beautiful thing. So a lot of the glory is going to God. And then that's where we get the famous verse in 4:7 says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So this is what Paul is saying as he talks about his own weakness, his own bodily sufferings, very physical, very real sufferings, but he always points it back to this glory of God. And it's such a beautiful thing that we can learn from Paul's life, this constantly pointing back in his own weakness, showing how his own weakness glorifies the Lord. So as we get into these verses, as he starts talking about outer self wasting away, we know this is what he's probably talking about. But he talks about this inner self being renewed and this heavenly home that we can look at. So looking at these verses, he starts first in verse 16 with, so we do not lose heart. And this is something that Paul repeats a few times, actually, if we look at some of these other verses. Chapter 3, verse 12 says, since we have such a hope, we're very bold. Chapter 4, verse 1 here again, he says, we do not lose heart. And then even in 5, 6, and 8, he says, we're always of good courage. So we see that Paul really has this perspective that God being glorified is something that encourages him. That's why he can have courage. It's why he can take heart in the middle of this, seeing that God does get the glory. So that's an important point that we want to make first. Then in verse 17, he starts doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting with our bodies in a way and the inner self or heavenly home, that kind of thing. So looking at verse 17, for the slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So the first contrast that's made here is this light momentary affliction. There is a temporary bad thing happening, but this eternal weight of glory. He doesn't just say, oh, we hope it's nice, we hope it will be something good, but he says it's beyond all comparison. So that's a really big point for why he can take courage, right? Knowing that this temporary bad thing is so little in the grand scheme of things. But when we actually look forward to heaven and to godliness, it's so worth it to endure this. So that's one contrast, first of all, is this light momentary affliction and eternal glory beyond comparison. And in verse 18, he brings up something else. He says, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So another thing we see about this body versus heavenly comparison is that one is seen and one is unseen. I think that's what I said. Yeah, so we really get this concept that I think is important for us to take note of. It's quite realistic that the things that are happening in the body, in the world right now, that's the things that we face on a day-to-day basis. As soon as we walk away from this meeting, that's what we will be experiencing. And we make our decisions right here, right now. And this is which is difficult for us to keep a heavenly focus sometimes. It's quite realistic that honestly we're not constantly thinking about God and we're not constantly thinking about heaven because we're not seeing those things right now. And it does take faith to think this way. As I was looking at this seen versus unseen thing, I had a verse come to mind from 1 Peter. So this is 1 Peter chapter 1, who's also talking about suffering and the good that suffering produces. And this is what he says. He says in verse 8, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. And this is really the seen versus unseen thing that we're talking about, that it does take faith to put our focus, to put our hope, to believe the things that we don't actually see. So it does take a very intentional perspective change to really think about godly things. And I think that's why in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, he says, we walk by faith, not by sight. So that's something we can take note of, that it does take this intentional change on the unseen things, instead of what's easy to focus on when we suffer or when we deal with frustrating things, I don't know, whatever it may be. It takes a very intentional change to act based off of the unseen things that we know. All right, in the beginning of chapter 5, he continues. He talks about this earthly home versus the heavenly home. And we really see that the earthly home is something that will be destroyed. And Paul has this longing, this looking forward to the heavenly home, which makes a lot of sense once we actually know his situation, right? Seeing that he's gone through so much suffering, enough to kill people many times over. I mean, shipwrecked 3 times, that can kill a person easily. He was stoned, it's supposed to kill people. So Paul had been through so much, and it makes a lot of sense for him to say, I want heaven, no more of this. But the really beautiful thing that we see with Paul is that he doesn't just say, Lord, take me home now, get me out of this. He says something quite different that shocks me a bit, and that's in verse 9. He says, so whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. Paul has shown us that we can take hope, that we can take comfort in knowing the heavenly things, but he shows that his attitude is always, in every situation, not about himself. It's always asking this question of God, how can I glorify you in this time? Regardless of what I have to go through, you stone me again, fine, but God, you take the glory. How can I please you? And we see that Paul did go through so much more stuff as he was imprisoned, taken to Rome. All of this we see in Acts, that he did go through so much more suffering even after writing this. But that's the perspective that I really want us to focus on today, that I was focusing on. This is the part that shocked me, is that, God, how can I please you in this? Rather than asking these questions about what's good for me right now. How can I make myself better right now? How can I make myself more comfortable? And this is something that I started asking, especially during this circuit breaker time, is, God, how can I please you in this? Instead of focusing on my own inconveniences, all of frustrating things that may happen, all of my own worries, God, how can I please you in this time? I think it's important to take note of Paul's motivation here. I have another story. I will keep this general because I don't want anyone to get offended. But I had another tiny human friend, another child. She was about 5 years old a few years back. And she started bringing me these handwritten notes every day, or sometimes a flower, sometimes a pretty picture that she had drawn. Just every day she would bring me something like this. And it was such a special and cute relationship. We just enjoyed each other. And there was another adult around, giving her a lot of candy, trying to bribe some love out of her. And it was sweet. We were all very good friends. But one day this girl said, "Oh, I like that person, that other adult. They give me candy." And so I stopped and I asked her, "But little friend," I will refrain from saying her name, "but why do you like me? Because I don't give you candy." And what she said was, "Oh, because you are special." And that was something that really taught me about this thing, making it our aim to please him. Because I saw that my friend, this child, she wasn't coming to me with nice things because I would give her something. I was the strict one who would never pass on my candy or anything. I wanted it too. So I see that she really wasn't trying to bribe anything out of me. I wasn't trying to earn her affection. I definitely did not need more pictures to hold on to or flowers that were realistically weeds. They were not flowers. But we really just enjoyed each other, and we liked to love each other and just please each other because there was that simple, loving relationship. And that's what I have in mind as I see Paul here, aiming to please God. It's not that God is going to get him out of everything he doesn't want to experience, but it's Paul loving the Lord as his Father and wanting God to get glory. So as we look at this question, what it means for us, I've asked God quite a few times recently, okay, how can I please you in this time then? What does it mean to make it my aim to please you? And there's a big temptation to say things like, oh, I can pray for a few more hours every day since I'm stuck at home, or I can do something for God. I don't know, something like that. But every single time that I have asked this question, I felt like God has pointed me back to relationships. He's pointed me back to the number of people I have heard in Singapore who are lonely, even before the circuit breaker. So many young people, old people, so many who are victims of the constantly busy life and kind of get left behind in relationships a bit, who don't have the deep relationships. There are lonely people. And that's one thing I felt challenged in is, am I reaching out to people? Whether they're a close friend, whether they're a distant acquaintance, that's something so easy for me to do, is just send a text and say, hey, how are you doing? And take a minute and pray for them. That's all it needs, is 1 minute, and pray for them. And that's something I felt challenged by. Another thing would be, how do I treat the people that I'm living with? Am I a kind person to them, especially when we're locked in together? But even after circuit breaker, when we go back to normal lives gradually, do they know that I love them? Am I patient with them? Am I doing what's good for me, or am I really truly loving them? This is another area that challenged me, is how can I love on those around me? Whether it's family, whether it's a roommate, whether it's even people who are far away, like my family right now, just how can I love on people a little bit more? And then another big thing that I felt as I asked God this thing about how can I please you, is really a critical spirit that we may or may not have had, especially with so many changes happening in all of our lives. There are different things that we might be grieving, different things that we have to adapt to, different things we have to let go of or take on. For some people, this is a busier season than ever. For others, it's boring, completely boring. So for all of us, I think there's a big temptation to criticize, though. Criticize the way decisions are made. But instead of that criticalness, I've been challenged to be accepting and be encouraging in this time, to be the voice that does stand out a little bit like that. And I think that that's something beautiful that we can do, is to be the difference in that sense. So this is kind of my goal for today as I share this devotion. That's my point, is this aim of pleasing the Lord. But I think also some people might just need the encouragement that comes with seeing that there is something greater than this. Realistically, people are grieving things and dealing with losses, and people are sick. And so what an encouragement we can have that there is something greater than this, that's full of glory, that's full of good things from the Lord. So whether it is that encouragement that we need, or whether it's this perspective change of wanting to please the Lord because we love him, this is what I want us to take away from this time. Just this question of, what does it mean to make it our aim to please him? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katy. So good to have you in the living room with us. And yeah, I really got so much from all that you were saying. Yeah, and even, yeah, I mean, being at home, it can be so difficult from time to time, but really very challenged by what you shared. So thank you so much. Yeah, so I'd just like to sum up what we heard today. Even though Paul was in some difficult times, he's looking towards God's glory for hope. And this is because he knows that our earthly home is temporary, but our heavenly home is eternal, and that's what we have to look forward to. So don't lose heart in the middle of that, and our hope is found in God getting the glory. We look to what is unseen and not what is seen, and we keep in mind that we live for something bigger than what we see right now. And lastly, even though the hope lies in the eternal, and it is important to have an eternal perspective, the things that happen now still matter. And we hold on to these two things in tandem, the hope of eternal life and the desire to please God right now, no matter what's happening. So the closing question that we want to leave you with is, what does it mean to aim to please God now? How do we do that? And how am I loving the people around me? So type a comment in the box below if you have something to share. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you for tuning in to our very first session of the living room. We hope you enjoyed the time with us. I think there was so much that we heard from Katy. So you can watch this again on our page. And yeah, we'll be going live on Facebook every Friday at 1 p.m. with a different guest. So watch our Instagram and Facebook for more details. God bless you and have a great weekend.